Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, before anyone had a word for it, before anyone understood what was actually happening, a bowl of wet grain sat forgotten in the corner of a settlement. Days passed. It should have simply rotted. Instead, it started to bubble, quietly on its own, and someone driven by hunger or curiosity or plain desperation decided to drink it anyway. That single, almost accidental decision may be one of the most consequential moments in human history, because what that person swallowed wasn't spoiled grain. It was beer, or something remarkably close to it, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what was happening inside that bowl, why it happened almost by accident, and why some researchers now argue this discovery may have shaped the entire course of early civilization. Let's start with the science hiding behind that first fermented bowl, because nothing about it required human intention at all. Wild yeast, invisible, airborne, and completely unnoticed by anyone at the time, exists almost everywhere on Earth, floating through the air and settling naturally onto grain, fruit, and standing water. When that yeast lands on wet, starchy grain sitting at the right temperature for even a few days, it begins consuming the natural sugars inside the grain and converting them into alcohol and carbon dioxide, the same basic chemical process brewers still rely on today. Nobody had to invent fermentation. It was already happening constantly, quietly in nature, waiting for the right accidental conditions to bring it to human attention. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Archaeologists studying early human settlements have found residue on ancient pottery and grinding stones, suggesting that fermented grain beverages may go back further than the deliberate farming of crops that we usually credit as agriculture's true beginning. Some researchers have proposed something called the beer before bread hypothesis, the idea that early humans may have started deliberately gathering and storing wild grain, not primarily to bake it into food, but because they had already discovered, likely by accident, that stored grain left wet under the right conditions produced something worth drinking. Under this theory, the desire for fermented grain beverages may have been one of the genuine driving forces behind the shift from wandering hunter-gatherer life toward the earliest stages of settled agriculture. Think about how radical that idea actually is. The traditional story of civilization usually goes, humans learned to farm, and from farming came surplus, and from surplus came the settled communities, the cities, and eventually the layered societies we now call civilization. But this hypothesis flips a piece of that story on its head. It suggests that in at least some regions, part of the motivation for holding still long enough to plant and harvest grain deliberately wasn't only about solving hunger. It may have also been about reliably reproducing something people had already discovered they enjoyed, something that made gatherings feel warmer, made hard labor feel more bearable, and made shared meals feel like genuine celebrations. So how exactly did ancient people first stumble onto this discovery, before anyone understood yeast, sugar, or fermentation existed at all? The most likely explanation is remarkably simple and remarkably human. Stored grain sometimes got wet by accident, rain leaking through a poorly covered storage pit, a spilled water container, damp ground beneath a woven basket. Once wet grain sat undisturbed for several days in a warm climate, wild yeast naturally present in the environment would begin fermenting the sugars inside it, producing a mildly alcoholic, slightly fizzy, faintly sweet liquid. To someone living in a world without refrigeration, without food safety standards, and often facing genuine scarcity, that liquid wouldn't have looked disgusting or dangerous. It likely looked like an opportunity. Ancient people were remarkably practical about food. Very little that could conceivably be eaten or drunk went to waste. And a strange but pleasant tasting, mildly intoxicating liquid emerging from grain that would otherwise have been lost was, in a world of real scarcity, worth trying rather than discarding. Once someone tried it and noticed the effect, mild euphoria, warmth, relaxation, a noticeably different feeling than plain water or food ever produced, that experience would have been memorable enough to repeat deliberately. And once people started repeating it deliberately, they would have begun noticing which specific conditions produced the best results, how wet the grain needed to be, roughly how long it needed to sit, which storage containers seemed to work best. None of this required understanding fermentation as a chemical process. It only required paying close attention and repeating whatever had worked reliably before. The same basic method of learning that shaped nearly every other early human technology, refined slowly through trial, error, and memory passed down between generations. Consider how much silent experimentation must have happened along the way, entirely undocumented, entirely lost to history. For every batch that turned out mild and pleasant, there were almost certainly countless others that turned rancid, bitter, or genuinely dangerous. Batches contaminated by the wrong kind of bacteria rather than the beneficial yeast that produces alcohol. Ancient brewers, without ever using that word for themselves, were running a kind of slow generational experiment, refining technique through nothing more sophisticated than memory, taste, and repetition, gradually learning to recognize the difference between a batch worth drinking and one worth discarding, long before anyone had any scientific language to describe what they were actually doing. One of the most important physical confirmations of this entire story comes from a site called Godin Tepe in what is now Western Iran. Archaeologists working there in the late 20th century recovered pottery vessels dating back roughly 5,000 years, and when chemists analyzed the residue coating the inside of those vessels, they found calcium oxalate, sometimes called beerstone, a compound that forms specifically as a byproduct of brewing barley. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or a reasonable guess based on context. It was a direct chemical fingerprint, sealed inside pottery for thousands of years, confirming that a specific vessel in a specific ancient settlement had been used to brew something recognizably close to what we would still call beer today. Discoveries like this are part of why archaeologists no longer treat the earliest history of fermentation as speculation. It's measurable in the actual residue left behind on actual objects that real people used, thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word about what they were doing. The Sumerian material goes even further than simple religious reference. The hymn to Ninkasi, inscribed on clay tablets roughly 4,000 years old, isn't just a poem praising a goddess. Read carefully. It functions almost like a recipe, describing the process of soaking grain, allowing it to sprout, baking it into a specific kind of bread, and then combining that bread with water and allowing the mixture to ferment, step by step, in language detailed enough that modern brewers have actually reconstructed working beer recipes directly from its verses. Think about what that means. A 4,000-year-old religious hymn contains enough technical brewing detail that people today can follow it like an instruction manual and produce a drinkable result. That's not vague cultural memory. That's a preserved technical document, disguised as devotion to a goddess, describing a process ancient Sumerians clearly considered important enough to write down with real precision. This is where the archaeological evidence becomes especially compelling. Researchers examining ancient residue from sites in the region, often called the Fertile Crescent, along with parts of China and other early agricultural regions, have found chemical traces consistent with fermented beverages appearing remarkably early in the archaeological record, in some cases alongside or even before clear evidence of bread making. Pottery fragments recovered from some of humanity's earliest known settlements have tested positive for compounds associated with fermentation, oxalate residues, and specific chemical signatures that modern chemists can identify even thousands of years later. This kind of evidence doesn't just tell us that ancient beer existed. It tells us it existed early, at meaningful scale, and was clearly significant enough to specific communities that they were deliberately producing, storing, and likely trading it. One particularly striking piece of evidence comes from a site in what is now northern China, where archaeologists uncovered stone tools and pottery containing residues consistent with a fermented rice, honey, and fruit beverage dating back roughly 9,000 years. Remarkably early, even by the standards of this already ancient story. What makes this discovery especially significant is that it emerged from an entirely different set of ingredients and an entirely different region than the barley and wheat fermentation traditions, developing in the Fertile Crescent at a similar broad era. Once again, separate populations, separate available crops, separate specific techniques, and yet the same underlying discovery. Wet, sugar-rich plant material left to sit will ferment on its own, and the result is worth drinking. This isn't one culture stumbling onto something clever and passing the idea along a trade route. It looks like the same basic biology and the same basic curiosity producing the same basic outcome in multiple places independently. This pattern of independent discovery isn't limited to grain at all. Long before humans understood fermentation as a chemical process, honey diluted in water and left exposed to wild airborne yeast would ferment on its own into what we now call mead, likely one of humanity's very earliest alcoholic beverages, since it required no farming, no grinding, and no cooking at all, simply honey, water, time, and the same invisible yeast already floating through the air everywhere on Earth. On an entirely separate continent, with no possible contact whatsoever, indigenous peoples across South America independently developed chicha, a fermented beverage made primarily from maize. In many traditional chicha-making methods, the corn was first chewed by community members, whose saliva contains enzymes that break starches down into simpler sugars that wild yeast could then ferment far more easily. That's a remarkably sophisticated biochemical workaround, arrived at with zero understanding of enzymes or starch chemistry, purely through generations of trial, observation, and the accumulated wisdom of watching what worked. Line up mead in ancient Europe, chicha in ancient South America, rice wine in ancient China, and barley beer in the Fertile Crescent, and a pattern becomes almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. 4 separate regions, 4 separate primary ingredients, 4 separate methods refined independently over centuries. And in every single case, the same fundamental discovery: a sugar-rich substance, left wet, produces something worth drinking, something that changes how you feel, something worth building deliberate technique and eventually entire cultural practices around. Wherever humans existed, wherever the right ingredients and the right accidental conditions lined up, this discovery appears to have been essentially inevitable. There's a compelling practical angle here too, separate from taste or pleasure. In many ancient settlements, water sources were frequently contaminated with harmful bacteria, a serious and often lethal problem long before anyone understood germ theory or how disease actually spread. Beer, because of the fermentation and often boiling involved in its production, was quite by accident considerably safer to drink than untreated water in many ancient environments. Some historians argue this may have provided a genuine, if completely unintentional, survival advantage to communities that regularly consumed fermented grain beverages instead of raw water, particularly in densely settled towns and early cities where water contamination would have been a constant, serious danger. Ancient people had no concept of bacteria. They simply would have noticed, over repeated generations, that people who drank beer regularly seemed to get sick less often than those who didn't. A pattern significant enough to shape cultural habits even without anyone understanding the underlying reason why. There's a genuinely fascinating biological postscript to this whole story, one that modern genetic science has only recently been able to confirm. The specific strain of yeast responsible for most beer and bread fermentation today, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, shows clear genetic signs of having been domesticated by humans over thousands of years, in much the same way dogs, cattle, and wheat were domesticated. Researchers comparing wild yeast populations to the strains found in ancient and modern brewing have identified genetic differences consistent with generations of unconscious human selection. Brewers repeatedly saving a bit of one successful batch to start the next one, without ever understanding they were doing so, gradually and unintentionally breeding a yeast strain better suited to fermentation than its wild ancestors. This means the very organism responsible for beer's existence has itself been shaped by thousands of years of human behavior, an invisible domestication process running in parallel with the much more visible domestication of crops and animals that usually gets credited as agriculture's relationship. Ancient brewers never saw yeast. They had no microscopes, no concept of single-celled organisms, no idea that a living thing was doing the actual work inside their fermenting vessels. And yet, purely through the practical act of saving a portion of a good batch to help start the next one, generation after generation, they were unconsciously selecting for yeast strains that fermented more reliably, tasted better, and behaved more predictably than the wild yeast randomly drifting through open air. They were breeding an organism they didn't know existed, guided by nothing more than taste and memory. And the yeast strains modern brewers still use today carry the genetic fingerprints of that entirely unconscious, millennia-long selective process. Beer also appears to have carried genuine caloric and nutritional value in societies where food security could never be taken for granted. Fermented grain beverages retain meaningful calories, certain B vitamins, and other nutrients from the original grain, meaning ancient beer functioned as something closer to a nutritious, calorie-dense staple food rather than purely a recreational drink the way it's often framed today. In some ancient societies, beer was consumed daily, by entire households, including children, essentially functioning as a safer, more nutritious dietary staple in a world where clean water and reliable food supplies were never guaranteed. This helps explain why beer, once discovered, spread, and became culturally significant so quickly across so many separate early societies. The thread connecting ancient ceremonial brewing to the beer you might recognize on a modern store shelf runs much more directly than most people assume. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, Christian monasteries became some of the most important centers of organized, deliberate brewing anywhere in the world, refining recipes, record-keeping, and technique with a level of rigor that echoes the same trial and observation process ancient brewers had been running for thousands of years already, just now conducted by monks with the literacy and institutional stability to actually write everything down. Monasteries brewed beer partly for practical reasons, since it was calorie-dense, relatively safe compared to local water, and could be produced and stored reliably, and partly because monastic rules often permitted beer even during periods of fasting when solid solid food was restricted. Beer being classified, somewhat cleverly, as liquid bread. Many foundational techniques still used in brewing today, including the deliberate use of hops for flavor and preservation, were refined and standardized in these monastic breweries, directly continuing a chain of practical knowledge stretching back to that first accidentally fermented bowl of wet grain thousands of years earlier. Ancient Sumerian texts, some of the oldest written documents human civilization has ever produced, include detailed references to beer, including recipes, religious hymns dedicated to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, and even wage records showing workers being paid partly in beer rations. This wasn't a minor cultural footnote. Beer appears to have functioned as currency, as nutrition, as religious offering, and as social glue, often simultaneously within some of the very first large, organized human societies ever recorded. Think about what that means. Some of humanity's earliest writing, invented specifically to track trade, taxation, and resources in newly forming cities, was being used among other things to record beer rations and beer recipes. The invention of beer and the invention of written language appear to be tangled together at the very root of early civilization, not as separate historical footnotes, but as genuinely interconnected threads in the same emerging story. It's worth stepping back for a moment to appreciate just how many separate, unconnected threads of human history all converge on this single accidental discovery. A religious hymn in ancient Sumer doubling as a working recipe, a pyramid worker in Egypt receiving beer as part of his daily wage, alongside bread, simply to survive the demands of the labor. A monk in medieval Europe brewing ale during a religious fast because it technically counted as liquid food rather than solid. A Norse family gathering in a feasting hall, sharing fermented honey and grain as part of marking the changing seasons. A community in ancient South America chewing maize together to help unlock its sugars before letting it ferment into chicha. None of these people ever met. None of them shared a language, a religion, or a continent. And yet every single one of them arrived independently at some version of the exact same insight: leave the right sugary, starchy material wet, in the right conditions, for the right amount of time, and something worth drinking and worth building an entire tradition around will appear. That's an extraordinary thing for one accidental discovery to have produced, again and again, across so much of separate human history. Ancient Egypt tells a strikingly similar version of this same story, independently reinforcing just how central beer became to early organized society. Archaeological and textual evidence from Egypt shows that beer was a dietary staple across nearly every level of society, from ordinary laborers to royalty, and was frequently used as part of workers' wages. Some historians studying labor records connected to the construction of the pyramids have found evidence suggesting that the laborers building these enormous monuments were regularly compensated, partly in beer rations alongside bread, as a core part of their daily sustenance. This wasn't a reward or a luxury handed out occasionally. It functioned as basic nutrition, a dependable source of calories and hydration for people performing extraordinarily demanding physical labor in a civilization that, independently of Sumer, had also arrived at beer as an essential piece of daily life. Norse and Viking-age societies in Northern Europe offer yet another independent thread in this same broad tapestry. Archaeological finds from Scandinavia, including preserved drinking vessels and residue analysis from burial sites, indicate that fermented grain and honey-based beverages played a significant role in Norse social and religious life, associated with feasting halls, seasonal celebrations, and even funerary rites for the dead. Old Norse sagas and later written sources reference ale drinking as central to hospitality customs and communal gatherings, reinforcing a pattern you've now seen repeat across nearly every region examined in this video. Fermented beverages functioning simultaneously as nutrition, as social glue, and as something bound up with a community's sense of the sacred. Different climate, different available grains, different specific customs, yet once again the same essential behavior arising independently, tied to the same fundamental human needs. So when you put all of these threads together, wild yeast interacting accidentally with wet stored grain, independent discoveries emerging in entirely separate regions, using entirely different ingredients, the practical safety advantage over often contaminated water, the real nutritional and caloric value fermented grain provided, the powerful social, religious, and economic significance beer quickly took on once discovered, and the slow, invisible domestication of the yeast organism itself, you start to see why this single accidental discovery may have shaped far more of human history than most people ever realize. Not every researcher fully agrees on the strongest strongest version of the beer before bread hypothesis, and it's worth being honest about that ongoing debate rather than presenting it as fully settled. Some archaeobotanists argue that bread and porridge-like foods were almost certainly also being made from early grain harvests around the same broad period, meaning fermentation for drink and fermentation-adjacent processing for food likely developed alongside each other rather than one clearly preceding the other in every region. What nearly all researchers agree on, however, is that fermented beverages appear far earlier in the archaeological and chemical record than casual assumption would suggest, and that their social, religious, and nutritional importance in early settled societies was substantial enough to have genuinely influenced how, why, and where people chose to settle down and begin farming in the first place. Whether beer came strictly before bread or grew up alongside it, the underlying point remains just as striking. Fermentation wasn't a late refinement added onto an already established agricultural society. It was present, in some form, right at the foundation. Consider, too, how this discovery required absolutely no specialized knowledge to begin, only patience, and a willingness to experiment with something unfamiliar. Every ingredient involved, wild grain, water, warmth, time, was already sitting in front of nearly every early human community on Earth. Nothing needed to be imported. Nothing needed to be invented from scratch. The chemistry of fermentation had been running in the background of the natural world for millions of years before humans existed at all. In rotting fruit, in wet seed pods, in any sugar-rich material exposed to warm, damp air. Humans didn't create this process. They simply noticed it, tasted the result, and crucially decided it was worth doing again on purpose. It's worth noting how much of that ancient process survives, essentially unchanged, in modern craft brewing today. Strip away the stainless steel equipment, the temperature-controlled fermentation tanks, and the precise scientific measurements, and the underlying process a contemporary craft brewer follows. Soak grain, allow sugars to develop, introduce yeast, control temperature, weight, taste, and adjust, is recognizably the same fundamental sequence ancient brewers were already refining thousands of years before anyone understood the biochemistry behind any single step. Modern brewers have simply replaced trial and error guesswork with precise scientific control over exactly the same natural process that once began entirely by accident, in a bowl of forgotten grain that somebody against every reasonable instinct decided to drink anyway. It's worth pausing on how strange it is that a substance discovered essentially by accident, through nothing more than rain leaking into a storage pit, went on to shape currency systems, religious practice, written language, and the compensation of the very workers who built some of humanity's most enduring monuments. Nobody planned any of this. There was no single inventor, no founding moment where someone set out deliberately to create a beverage that would reorganize how early societies functioned. It was closer to a slow-motion accident, repeated independently across multiple regions, each time producing consequences far larger than the simple act of leaving wet grain out too long ever seemed to warrant. It wasn't a minor recreational beverage that appeared after civilization was already established. In many regions, it may have been one of the very forces that helped make settled civilization possible in the first place. So the next time you see a bottle or a glass of beer, you're looking at something considerably older and considerably stranger than a modern beverage choice. You're looking at what may be one of the oldest deliberate biotechnologies your species ever developed, born from an accident involving wet grain, invisible yeast, and a moment of very human curiosity thousands of years ago, refined generation after generation into something powerful enough to help shape the earliest cities, the earliest writing, and the earliest organized societies human history has ever produced. And perhaps the strangest part of all is how ordinary the beginning of that story really was. No genius moment, no single flash of insight, just wet grain, forgotten in a corner, doing exactly what nature does when given the right conditions, and one person somewhere at some point deciding that what should have been thrown away was worth tasting instead. Multiply that single small decision across dozens of separate regions and thousands of years, and you get one of the most consequential accidental discoveries your species has ever stumbled into, still sitting quietly in a glass in front of you. Thousands of years later, exactly where that first curious, hungry, or simply thirsty person left it.